Chapter 47. The Warrior. Another young wrestler I was helping to develop was the Dingo Warrior. In the summer of 1986, I was looking to create a tag team. I wanted to have two guys who looked like they came from the Bowery in New York City, and name them Dingo and Socko simply because I thought they were unusual names that the fans might notice out of curiosity. When Jim Hellwig came into Texas, I watched him wrestle, and though he was very green, thought he would be perfect for the role of Dingo. I talked to him after his match, and he told me he went to college in Marietta, Georgia and got a degree in chiropractic medicine, but found that he preferred bodybuilding and wrestling. He even laid me on a table and gave me a decent chiropractic adjustment. He told me that Red Bastian had trained him how to wrestle, so I asked him if he was looking for someone who would help get him to the next level, and he said he was. That night we made a deal for him to become Dingo, and for me to become his manager. I suggested that he come down to the Sportatorium, where I could get Tim Brooks to really teach him the fundamentals of wrestling, but Jim made it very clear to me that he wasn't interested in that. All he wanted me to do was to help him become a big-name wrestler, because he wasn't interested in becoming the greatest wrestler on the card. He also felt that training at the Sportatorium would interfere with his workout schedule, because he worked out twice a day. When I couldn't find the right Socko, I figured that since Kerry was the modern-day Warrior, and the one-man gang did a good job as the Halstead Street Warrior, Jim should be named the Dingo Warrior. The first night I went to the ring with him, I walked behind him so I could get a better perspective of the people's reaction to him, and I could watch the fans watch him. On the way to the ring, women were reaching out and hugging him, and I knew I had a winner. He had so much charisma, that even though his in-ring work was very green, the people forgave him for that. They simply didn't care. I spent a lot of time helping him build his career, and I did it by watching his matches and making suggestions to him. The things he did well I encouraged him to keep doing, and the things that the people didn't pick up on I advised him to drop. That was my process with Jim. He had great potential, and I was simply molding him so that he wouldn't do anything that made him look bad. A couple of things were clear right off the bat. When he lifted his opponent over his head, the crowd would pop, and when he clotheslined a guy, the crowd would pop again. However, those were the only two things he knew how to do, so I had to figure out other things for him. That's when I came up with the shaking of the ropes. If you watch the tapes of him and me, he would do something in the ring, then come over and talk to me, then go do something else, and come back to me again. What I was doing was saying, throw him to the ropes and catch him in a bear hug, body slam him, and things like that. That was par for the course, though. Then one day, just to change it up, I instructed him, before you come back, shake the ropes, scream, and pound on your chest. I was thinking Tarzan. That's exactly what I was thinking in my mind, and he began to develop that image. Because he was so limited by his in-ring performance, I put him in a tag team with Matt Bourne so he could have longer matches. By being part of a team, Jim could let Matt do most of the work, and come in for just a bit and take over. Basically, I structured his matches to fit his ability at that time. Even though I was managing the Dingo Warrior, it was obvious that no matter what we did, the people refused to dislike him. Therefore, the Dingo Warrior could never really be considered a heel, because the fans refused to see him in that light. He was a beautiful, magnificent specimen that they adored. That was fine by me, and I managed and developed him until he was ready and the time was right. And then Abdullah the Butcher and I turned on him, making him a huge babyface and feuding with him for quite a while. Clips of world-class championship wrestling were replayed on TV Tokyo in Japan, and one evening, Antonio Inoki saw the Dingo Warrior on TV and felt he would really get over in his New Japan promotion. Someone from his office got in touch with me, wanting to know if I could send them Kevin Von Erich, the Dingo Warrior, and Scott Hall for a tour of Japan. I told him that I didn't book Scott Hall, but I made a deal to send Kevin and the Warrior to Japan for big money. As soon as I made that deal, Pat Patterson called me, telling me that he had just signed the Dingo Warrior to a deal with the WWF. I was very happy for Jim, because I knew that the WWF would be far better for him than World Class could. Because in World Class, to have longevity you had to be a good worker. No disrespect to Jim, but he was never what I would call a smooth, polished worker. He was simply a superhero come to life. When Pat told me of the deal, I explained the situation I was in, saying I just made arrangements for the Warrior to go to New Japan for Antonio Inoki. Can he do that first? No, we want him in the WWF as soon as possible, Pat replied. We don't want him in any kind of contact with Inoki. Pat realized that the Warrior had fantastic charisma and incredible potential, and didn't want him working for anyone outside of the WWF. My hands were tied, so I said, he's yours. I hope you do wonderful things with him and that you all get rich. Needless to say, my wish came true. Jim went to the WWF and became one of the hottest guys there, and I'm very proud of him for accomplishing so much in such a short period of time. He did his gimmick very well and he drew a lot of money being who he was, because in the WWF, the fans didn't care about his work rate, all they cared about was the adrenaline rush they got when they saw him wrestle. I know that in the end, there were some hostilities between Jim and the WWF, but I personally can't say anything derogatory about him, because I never saw that side of him. When the Warrior was with me, he was just a sweet guy who wanted to learn how to get over and stay over. Anyhow, at the time that the Dingo Warrior left World Class, I had him as the Texas Heavyweight Champion. Since Pat wanted him in the WWF as soon as possible, I asked Jim if it was okay if we said Al Perez beat him for the belt in Puerto Rico. Jim was kind enough to okay that phantom title change, and personally dropped the belt off at my office. As an interesting side note, by Pat signing the Warrior and calling me when he did, he truly changed the course of two men's careers. It turns out that Antonio Inoki not only wanted Jim Hellwig for a tour of Japan, but he also wanted him for a new character he was creating named Big Van Vader. Since Jim had to cancel his tour of Japan, the role of Vader eventually went to Leon White, who at the time was wrestling for the American Wrestling Alliance. Kevin Von Erich, Scott Hall, and Rick Hazard eventually went on that Japanese tour. Kevin and Scott went to wrestle, and I got Rick a deal to go and make some extra money as a referee. During their tour, I got a phone call late one night from someone who worked in the New Japan office. He was frantic, and the only things I could understand were Scott Hall and Kevin Von Erich. I kept trying to tell him that I didn't book Scott Hall, and that he needed to call someone with the American Wrestling Alliance. The following morning, I got another call from someone in Inoki's office, but this person spoke English. Apparently Kevin, Scott, and Rick had gone out for a night on the town, got drunk on some sake, and pissed on the wall of a restaurant. The Yakuza, which is the Japanese mob, happened to be there and were highly insulted, so they followed them back to their hotel, and when Scott and Kevin went off to their rooms, the Yakuza grabbed Rick Hazard and stabbed him 17 times. They didn't go into any arteries, but they cut him over both his eyes and across his nose. New Japan sent him home immediately, and everyone at World Class tried to squash the story. The worst thing is, when Rick got back, Fritz blamed the whole incident on him. He said it was Rick's fault for not keeping Kevin in line. That seemed to be Rick's lot in World Class, though. He was the company's whipping boy, and if something got messed up, everybody would point their finger at him. I had a real good crew with me in the office, especially in my booking assistant, Percival Pringle. Percy was very helpful to me, because not only did he work in the office, but he also did the programs, managed, and wrestled. Percy's a sweetheart, I love him to death. And I'm so glad he got his position as pallbearer with the WWF. He did extremely well there, and no one deserved it more than him. He was a great assistant for me, and a good sounding board for things, much like Sir Oliver Humperdinck was to me in Florida and North Carolina. Kathy White was the office secretary, and I've mentioned her name a couple of times thus far. She was from Chicago like me and started out with Southwest Sports in the 60s as Fritz's personal secretary. She was devoted to him and to wrestling. Even though Fritz came first, she always looked after me, too, and made time to take care of my business. She was a wonderful, sweet woman who knew more about the wrestling business than Fritz and I put together. She had been with the company over 30 years when she retired during my second run as the booker. She retired to a nice section of Irving with her dog and her crippled mother, and one day, two guys broke in, killed the dog, and viciously murdered Kathy in her bathtub. The police found her with her throat cut and the dog with its head bashed in. Talk about a Von Erich curse. One night, World Class was running a show in Corpus Christi, and as I was standing in front of the building, none other than Billy Goals walked up to me, exclaiming, "Hey kid. How you doing?" I hadn't seen him in 24 years, since the day I left Chicago. We sat down, started to talk, and it was like I had just left him yesterday. He kept telling me how proud he was of me, but he also told me that the past couple of decades had been hard on him. Billy's son went to Vietnam and was killed, and Billy was never the same after that. He had recently moved to Corpus Christi, so I asked him if he would be interested in promoting the town. Wrestling was Billy's life, so he was thrilled with my offer because it offered him an opportunity to be back around the boys, which was where he wanted to be. I put him on salary, and he helped me book local wrestlers, look after the box office, and basically run Corpus Christi. It was such a great pleasure that I could give him back a little after all he had given me, and anytime he thanked me, I would assure him, "This is nothing compared to what you did for me." I was very fortunate that I was in a position to do that for him. Anytime I could help a guy that had given me a hand up when I was starting out was a big thrill for me. I was honored to do that for Billy, and he did an excellent job. We also got sports and entertainment promoter Steve Corey involved in World Class, as well. He had promoted John McEnroe's Tennis Over America tour, and was the late, great Stevie Ray Vaughan's concert promoter. Steve got us booked for about 20 shows on the East Coast, and we called it Von Erich's Over America. The shows were great, but Steve, like every other promoter, wanted to create a character of his own. At first he wanted to call him the Amoeba, but I gently explained to him that a gimmick like that might not get over. At the time, Coca-Cola was calling itself the Real Thing in their advertisements, so he went out, found a local bodybuilder, and named him The Thing. Pretty creative. Bruiser Brody was booked against The Thing one night, and during their match, Brody picked up a chair and beat The Thing all over his body. It turns out The Thing had gone into Brody's dressing room before the match and told Brody what he could and could not do in the ring that night. Bruiser was a wonderful guy, but nobody told him what he could and could not do. One time Bruiser and Abby asked me to book them in a cage match. I thought it was a great idea, but I also realized that neither of them liked to lose, because it wasn't good for their gimmicks. It's a hell of an idea, guys, but who's going to do the job? They told me not to worry, and that they would figure it out. I said, okay. It's in your hands. I'll book it, but you guys have to come up with the finish. The night of the show, I went to the dressing room to escort Abdullah to the ring, and he and Brody were sitting there talking. I asked, so how are we ending this tonight? They both looked at me dumbfounded, so I asked, you guys haven't come up with a finish? It's time to go to the ring. The match is on right now. We're next. You come up with something, Bruiser said. No way, I told him. You guys wanted to be in a cage match, so you have to come up with the finish? I'll tell you this, though, if I don't have a finish in this match, I won't book either one of you ever again. They begged me to get involved for the finish, but I flat out refused. After escorting Abby to the ring, I even sat in a chair in the corner for the entire match. I never did that. I usually stood and paced around the ring to add some drama, but that night they were on their own. I let them go for 45 minutes, and the match stunk. Eventually, Bruiser Brody finally succumbed to the boredom of it all, got tired of Abby laying his 450 pounds on him, and figured that since it wasn't on TV, he might as well do the job. What a mess that was. Being a booker meant I had to deal with everyone's problems, both in the ring and out, and in World Class there was never a dull moment. One day, Kevin Von Erich and his youngest brother Criss got into a boat accident on Lake Dallas. It wasn't a big thing, and thankfully no one was severely hurt. They were just wild and crazy Texas boys. At another point, Kevin was in a rush to go someplace, and while backing out of his garage, his car pinned his 4-year-old daughter against the garage wall. It was simply one of those unfortunate instances where a child runs after her daddy, and no one knew she was there. She was roughed up, but not seriously injured. Kevin was really shaken up, though. Then one night we were in El Paso, and Kevin was in a match where he landed on the back of his head and knocked himself totally, absolutely goofy. When he got back to the dressing room, he was asking, "Where am I? What are we doing here?" He knew who I was, but didn't know where we were at or what we were doing. It was a severe concussion, but it was not his first one. In fact, Kevin had 7 concussions previously, because his wrestling style was all out. In retrospect, he probably should not have flown home that night, but he really wanted to see his family, and insisted he was feeling better. I was very concerned about him, though, and told him to take the next day off. However, like a good trooper, Kevin showed up the next night at the Will Rogers Auditorium, where we taped the KTVT show. The match was Kevin Von Erich, Bruiser Brody, and the Fantastics against Al Perez, Black Bart, Brian Adidas, and Al Madril. I was at ringside, and as Kevin was crisscrossing with Brian Adidas, his body began to contract. Suddenly, he turned bright red, then purple, and fell face forward on the mat. Thank God for Bruiser Brody and Tommy Rogers. They jumped in the ring and Bruiser pounded him a couple of times on his chest, while Tommy gave Kevin mouth-to-mouth resuscitation. Once again, the audience was shocked. They had been through so much with David, Gino, and Mike's deaths, and now there was more emotional baggage being dropped on them. They were in hysterics, and I was standing on the floor watching this. I couldn't break character, but in the ring one of my Von Erich boys was in serious trouble. I couldn't believe this was happening right in front of me. As I was standing there with my head racing, I noticed Mark Lawrence still doing the commentary. I ran over and yelled, "I don't want this on the air. Go to black." Even though some of the fans saw me telling him that was the one and only time I didn't care that I was breaking kayfabe. Mark and Tex, the KTVT director sitting in the truck, would have been perfectly content to just sit there and tape the traumatic event until the ambulance arrived had I not instructed them to stop filming. Finally, the paramedics got there, and after tending to him, determined that he had a seizure brought on by his concussion the night before. Fortunately, by that time he was breathing okay, but they took him to the hospital just to be on the safe side. I then called Fritz and told him what was going on, and that Kevin would be off for a couple of weeks. The next day, Fritz came into my office and asked me to put on my thinking cap and come up with a reason that Kevin collapsed. I suggested that we say he was attacked in the dressing room before the match, but Fritz didn't like that, and wanted something bigger. We started throwing ideas around, and one of his was that Brian Adidas had hit Kevin with a Duke Kyomica-like karate move. Fritz really liked that one, and told me to run with it. I did what he wanted, but I personally felt it was weak. Sure enough, the karate chop story never got over with the fans at all. There were times that I did things I felt uncomfortable with, but with that particular claim I felt really uncomfortable, because it was ridiculous and insulting to the audience. That and explaining how Mike Von Erich hurt his shoulder by hitting Tim Brooks were two of the hardest things I ever had to explain to the fans. Those, by the way, are just two examples that illustrate how, even though Fritz was a brilliant businessman, creativity simply wasn't his forte. I'm not trying to take anything away from his success, but believe me when I tell you he was not a great manipulator. Over the years, I've heard rumors that Kevin's collapse in Fort Worth was brought about by drugs, but that is totally, completely untrue. Let me say something about Kevin. Kevin is a very strong guy, a very special guy, and a survivor. Forget about the wrestling world, there's no one in life that has been through what he has. And today he's very well adjusted, copes well in life, and is doing great. That makes me very happy. One reason he's that way is because he always put his family before all else. He has a beautiful wife and 4 lovely children, would do anything for them, and is a devoted husband and family man. Even though Kevin was the oldest of the Von Erich brothers, everyone talked about how David was world champion material, and then carry 1 belt. It would appear that Kevin was overlooked, but in actuality, Kevin didn't want the world title. He was just happy being Kevin. That was his way, and Kevin would be the only one of the boys who would come to me and say, "Uncle Gary, my knee is hurt and I would like 7 days off." David and Kerry never asked for time off. Don't get me wrong, though. If Kevin was asked and told that we needed him to be champion for good of the family, he would have stepped right up. Doris Von Erich would stop by my office every now and then. I always had photos of my top guys on my wall, and on one wall I just had the Von Erich boys. She would come in, sit with me, and we would talk about the children. Doris is as wonderful a mother as a child could have. In the early years, just like in my house, Doris was mother and father to the boys, because Fritz was out making money and making a better life for the family. She had a wonderful bond and closeness with her children. When she would get up to leave my office, she would always go over to the wall where the Von Erich boys were, put her hand on David and Mike, rub their pictures, and cry. It was so hard for me to just sit there. What could I say? It happened about 3 times during my last stint as booker, but when she left my office, I was emotionally drained. Fritz, Kevin, and Kerry came into my office one day, and we all started discussing the direction of the company. At one point, Fritz and Kevin got into a heated discussion, and Fritz suddenly stood up. Kevin jumped up, doubled up his fists, got in a fighting stance, and cried, "You're not going to hit my anymore." At that point, Fritz looked stunned, and then yelled, "Why are you acting like that in front of this guy?" He was referring to me. After knowing the Von Erich family for over 20 years, I was no longer Uncle Gary. I became this guy, simply because I saw something that Fritz didn't want me to see. I also took what happened to mean that Kevin had been hit by Fritz before. Why else would he jump up and double up his fists?